It's 3:14 in the morning, and you're awake. Fully awake. Your brain has located something you said in 2014 and would like to walk you through it now, at length, with annotations. And the first thing you feel isn't tiredness. It's dread. Small, specific, administrative dread. Something is wrong with you. You have work in 5 hours. You've been told an adult needs 8 unbroken hours, and you are visibly failing at that. So you check your phone, which makes it worse. You do the maths, 4 hours and 41 minutes. And then you do it again in case it comes out better. It doesn't. You lie there resenting your own body until about 3:30, and you wake up feeling like you lost a fight with a cart. 700 years ago, in a cold, smoky, one-room cottage in the English countryside, a man called Watt woke up at exactly the same hour. Same darkness, same open eyes, same invisible ceiling, and he felt nothing about it whatsoever. That hour wasn't a failure. It was ordinary. It was expected, and it had a name. So let's move you in with Watt. It's about 1350. The cottage has one room, an earth floor, some rushes on top of the earth to make the earth feel special, and a fire in the middle with no chimney. The smoke leaves through a hole in the thatch eventually, having first passed through everyone in the building. Watt has been breathing his own dinner for 11 years. There's no glass in the window. There's a wooden shutter, and when it's closed, the room goes dark in a way you have honestly never experienced. Not bedroom dark. There's no street light, no standby light, no phone charging on the floor like a tiny angry moon. Shutter closed, fire banked, and Watt cannot see his own hand. He knows where his hand is. He's just taking it on trust. He goes to bed shortly after sunset because there is nothing to do without light, and candles cost roughly a day of his life each. In winter, that puts him horizontal at 6 in the evening, and he's not getting up until dawn, which is 14 hours away. You've already done that sum because everyone does, and you've arrived at the obvious objection. Nobody sleeps 14 hours. You have never once managed 9. So what's happening in the middle? What sleeps about 4 hours? Then he wakes up. No alarm, no distress, no reason, and stays awake for an hour or two. Then he goes back down for another 4. 2 sleeps with names. The first one was called your first sleep. The second one was called your second sleep. Medieval England was not fussy about branding. The gap in between was the watch or the watching. And the reason this vanished from history is the reason most things vanish from history. It was too boring to write down. Nobody in 1350 sat down to explain the 2 sleeps. In the same way, nobody this century has sat down to explain breakfast. The words just turn up, mid-sentence, in the middle of a story about a horse. And the writer carries straight on because every single reader already knows. Which is what makes the evidence so good once you spot it, and also why it took one historian 16 years. He wasn't hunting a lost document in a vault. He was noticing a phrase that had been sitting in printed books for 400 years, being read past by everybody, including him, until one day it stopped looking like nothing. The historian is A. Roger E. Kirch at Virginia Tech, and he did the thing nobody had bothered to do. He read all of it. Diaries, court depositions, medical manuals, plays, poems, letters, ballads, wills, several languages, several centuries, and the same 2 phrases kept surfacing, casually, in documents that had nothing to do with sleep. He published the argument as an article in 2001, Sleep We Have Lost, and then as a book, at Day's Close, in 2005. By then he'd collected more than 500 separate references. Sit with that number, because it's the whole case, not one source describing something strange. 500 sources mentioning something normal, in passing, without explanation, across hundreds of years. If somebody handed you 500 documents that referred to second breakfast and never once defined it, you wouldn't conclude that second breakfast was a curiosity. You'd conclude you had been missing a meal, and the range is the convincing part. These aren't all learned men writing for other learned men. Some of them are illiterate villagers giving evidence in a murder case, and the clerk writing it down doesn't stop too. Explain the phrase either, because why would he? Nobody explains lunchtime. 3 of them are better than any summary I could give you. Chaucer first. In The Squire's Tale, around 1390, a character goes to bed, sleeps, and gets up after her first sleep. That's it. That's the reference. He doesn't explain it. He doesn't linger. He mentions it the way you'd mention a Tuesday. 600 years later, a professor at Virginia Tech reads that line and has to go and sit down. Second, the medical text. Physicians of the period offered couples advice on the best hour for conceiving a child, and the recommended slot was after the first sleep. Their reasoning was gloriously unromantic. You're rested, you're warm, and you have not just done 14 hours in a field. This is not poetry. This is a doctor giving you a calendar invite. Third, And this is what closes the argument, the court records. There are depositions where villagers describe hearing something in the night and fix the time by saying it happened during the watch, between the sleeps. That's a witness, under oath, using the phrase as a unit of time. He is the 14th century equivalent of a man saying, "It was around lunchtime." You cannot fake that, and nobody had any motive to. Court clerks weren't building a theory of sleep. They were writing down what a bloke said he heard, in a case about a stolen pig, 4 centuries before anyone thought the sentence was interesting. That's the best evidence there is. Not the document written to persuade you, but the one written for something else entirely that happens to leave a fingerprint. Which leaves the far better question. What did they do in there? They talked. That comes up more than anything else. You're in a bed with your spouse, possibly your children, possibly a lodger nobody remembers agreeing to. And you lie in the dark and you talk. Not planned conversation. The drifting, unguarded, 3 in the morning kind, in a room where nobody can see anybody's face, and there is a nowhere else on earth to be. Here's one. I've invented the words, but the shape is accurate. Do you think Hodge knows? Knows what? Anything. And then a very long pause. And then, no? Notice how few of those you've had. The modern equivalent barely exists. There is no hour in your life that is guaranteed, shared with the person beside you, free of screens, free of obligation, and long enough that you say something you hadn't planned to say. You've got the car, occasionally, and that only works because neither of you can look at the other one. For Watt and Alice, it wasn't a treat. It was structural. Every night for the whole of a marriage, because there was nothing else on offer and nowhere else to go. Ekirch's sources are full of what came out of it. Household decisions taken in the watch. Arguments started and finished. Plans laid. Children conceived, on medical advice, as previously discussed. An entire layer of family life ran in that hour. Then cheap artificial light quietly deleted it and nobody filed a complaint, because nobody noticed for 200 years. One institution had already built its entire timetable around that gap, centuries earlier. The Rule of St. Benedict, written around 530, lays out the offices of the monastic day, and among them is the night office. Matins, sometimes vigils, sung in the small hours, in the dark, between the sleeps. The monks weren't inventing a hardship. They didn't drag themselves out of bed at an unnatural hour to prove their devotion. They found everybody already awake and installed a service. Structurally, it's a religious order colonizing the one-time slot with no competition. Ordinary people use the hour the same way on a smaller scale. There are prayers written specifically for that window. Devotional manuals assume the reader will be conscious in the middle of the night and hand them something to say, which is not an assumption anyone would make about you at 3:14. I'm describing an institution here, not making a claim about faith. What matters is the evidence it leaves behind. When an order builds a permanent 1,000-year timetable around one particular hour of the night, that hour was not rare, and it was not an accident. There's a stranger use of the watch, and it's the one I'd actually want back. They thought about their dreams. Look at the conditions. You've come up out of sleep directly. No alarm, no light, no noise, no screen. You're lying in total darkness with nothing to do for the next 90 minutes and no realistic prospect of a distraction arriving. Under those conditions, people remembered dreams in a detail that is more or less lost to you. And they talked about them and interpreted them. And there was a whole industry of dream interpretation running through medieval Europe with a genuine readership, because the raw material was arriving nightly and in high definition. You have none of this. You wake to an alarm and a rectangle and the dream is gone in 4 seconds. Someone could offer you money and you could not tell them what it was. It isn't that you've stopped dreaming. It's that nothing in your morning is built to catch it. The one condition that preserves a dream is lying still in the dark afterwards with nothing to do, and that condition was abolished for everybody at roughly the same time as the gas lamp. A third of your life happens in there and you receive no reports. Not everyone stayed in bed. The records have villagers getting up to check animals, to brew, to mend things, and, this is real, to call on the neighbors in the middle of the night, which sounds insane until you remember the fact that makes it work. The neighbors were awake too. That's the part I'd hold on to. The watch wasn't a private hour. It was a dark, quiet, shared hour that an entire village was passing through at roughly the same time, because the sun had set on all of them at once and there had been nothing anyone could do about it. Somebody also had to deal with the fire. It was banked rather than burning, and in many towns a bell rang at dusk and you were legally required to smother your hearth for the night. because your neighbor's house was made of sticks and hair and your stray ember was everybody's business. So Watt checks the embers, because if that fire dies, he's facing either a long humiliating morning with flint and tinder, or a walk to Hodge's door to borrow a live coal. And Hodge will mention it. Hodge will mention it for a year. The French for cover the fire is couvre-feu. You've been saying that word your entire life. It started as a fire regulation. Fine, you might think. People did things differently. So what? Except your body appears to have kept the pattern. In the early 90s, a psychiatrist called Thomas Weir at the National Institute of Mental Health ran an experiment that is almost aggressively simple. He took volunteers and put them in darkness for 14 hours a night. No light, nothing to do. 14 hours, which is a winter night at that latitude before artificial light existed. For the first fortnight, they mostly slept one long catch-up block because they were carrying a sleep debt, as almost everybody is. Then, it reorganized itself. By about week 4, the volunteers had settled into 2 blocks of roughly 4 hours, separated by 1 to 2 hours of quiet wakefulness in the middle. Weir published it in the Journal of Sleep Research in 1992. Nobody had told them anything about medieval sleep. They weren't reproducing anything. Put a modern human in a 14-hour night for a month, and this is where the body goes unsupervised. And the interval itself turned out to be odd. Weir measured elevated prolactin during the waking hour, which goes with a calm, still restful state. The volunteers didn't describe it as insomnia. They described something closer to meditation. So, the thing you feel at 3:14 may be the oldest part of your night, turning up punctually to a life that has nowhere to put it. Now, somewhere out there, a man is already typing, and for once, he has a point. So let's give him the floor before he gets to the comments. Not every researcher accepts that segmented sleep was universal. The strongest challenge landed in 2015, when a team led by Gandhi Yatish published a study in Current Biology on 3 pre-industrial societies: hunter-gatherers and horticulturalists in Tanzania, Namibia, and Bolivia. These are people living without electric light, which is precisely the condition the whole theory is about. They did not sleep in 2 blocks. They slept in 1. They slept less than you'd assume, around 6.5 hours, and they went to bed several hours after sunset rather than at it. That's a serious result, and it has to be taken seriously. The reasonable reading is that 2 sleeps aren't a universal human default, but a response to one specific condition: a very long night. All 3 of those societies sit near the equator, where the night runs about 12 hours all year round. The Kirch's evidence is overwhelmingly Northern European, where a winter night is 16. So the 2 sleeps may not be what humans do. They may be what humans do when the night is too long to sleep through, which, if you live in Britain or Canada or anywhere with a genuinely miserable January, is still your night. Your latitude hasn't moved. Only the lighting has. The honest position is narrower than the headline and considerably more interesting than it. Segmented sleep was ordinary in Northern Europe for centuries in winter, and ordinary enough that nobody defined it. Whether your ancestors on some other continent did the same is unsettled, and anyone who tells you otherwise hasn't read the 2015 paper. Let me now undercut myself properly, because you should not leave here thinking medieval sleep was a lost paradise. The bed was appalling. It's a sack stuffed with straw or chaff on a low frame or straight on the floor. It compresses under you within weeks. It has to be emptied and restuffed, because it doesn't stop being soft. It becomes lumpy, and the lumps develop personalities. It also has tenants. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were standard. Not a scandal, just the natural consequence of a warm body in a straw sack in a house that also contains a pig. Household accounts include money spent on herbs strewn in the bedding to discourage them, which tells you 2 things. People tried, and it didn't work. Watt has a bedbug. I've decided to call him Jeffrey. Jeffrey is the only member of that household who is thriving. You're not alone in the bed either. Beds were shared, and not only with family. Stay at an inn and you'd very likely be put in with a stranger. And this stayed normal in parts of Europe for another 400 years. Travelers complain about the specific stranger, never about the arrangement. You're cold, the fire's banked, the window is a hole, and your blanket is doing all of the work, which is why people slept in a shift and wore a hat to bed. And you're breathing smoke, because the layer under the thatch takes all night to clear. Lumpy, verminous, crowded, freezing, and smoky. Dropped into that bed tonight, you'd have a horrendous night, and you'd be right about every part of it. So if the bed was that bad, what exactly was better? 3 things, and none of them are comfort, darkness, Real darkness, of a kind that mostly no longer exists where people live. Your body decides when to release melatonin based on light, and it is not fooled by you closing your eyes. In a shuttered cottage, that signal arrived clean, and it arrived early, every night, with no argument from anybody. Temperature. Your core temperature has to drop for sleep to start properly, and a cold room does that for you. Your bedroom, heated to a pleasant 20 degrees, is quietly working against you until morning. The miserable, unheated cottage was, in this one narrow respect, doing you a favor: schedule. Sunset put Watt down, sunrise brought him up, and it did that consistently, because there was no alternative on the market. No shift work, no late episode, no one more. 3 advantages, all accidental, none of them chosen, all of them free. And there's a 4th, which is the one that actually matters, and it isn't physical at all. They weren't frightened of the gap. When you wake at 3 in the morning, the waking isn't the problem. The problem is the 20 minutes afterwards, the counting, the calculating, the low-grade panic about tomorrow, which raises your heart rate and floods you with exactly the alertness that stops you going back down. You're not lying awake because you woke up. You're lying awake because you had opinions about waking up. Watt had precisely the same interruption. He simply had no reason to read it as damage. There was no clock on the wall, no number to fail against. Nobody had ever told him how many hours a healthy adult requires, because nobody had counted, because there was no instrument and no reason to build one. There was an hour of dark, and then there was more sleep, and in the morning nobody asked how it had gone. That's the difference between his night and yours. It isn't the mattress and it isn't the light, it's that nobody ever handed him a target. You've been given a number, told it's medically necessary, sold a device that measures how badly you missed it, and then left alone in the dark at 3 in the morning with the results. So, would you actually sleep better in 1350? In the bed itself, no. It's lumpy, it bites, it's freezing, and you're sharing it with a man you met that afternoon, and Jeffrey, who was here first. But the night around the bed was better than yours. The dark, the cold, the timing, and above all, the total absence of anything informing you that you were doing it wrong. Not through wisdom. They hadn't worked any of this out. They simply had no way of building the alternative, so the alternative never turned up to spoil it. The 8 unbroken hours rule you're quietly failing every week isn't an ancient truth about the human body. It's roughly as old as cheap light and the factory shift. For most of the time there have been people, the night had 2 halves and a quiet hour in the middle. So next time you find yourself awake at 3:14, staring at a ceiling you can't see, consider the possibility that nothing has gone wrong. You might just be early.